Good morning and good evening and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen and dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada, we welcome all of you to the third part of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute and International Institute of Sociology from Erasmus Rotterdam University's joint venture e-seminar on Banyamulenge and Rohingya genocide crisis. In this third part, we have a wonderful panel today before us, and before I go into introducing them, let me traditionally acknowledge our treaty. The Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Metis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Dear audience, as I mentioned, we have a fantastic panel lined up today, and let me introduce according to their appearance in this session. Our first speaker is Dr. Helen Hingens, and she's from Rotterdam University, and she's going to speak on colonial legacies and present identity politics, comparing racism in two cases. And our second speaker, Jean-Pierre Muyambere, and he's going to talk about eliminating methodically the scam and vermin, the case of Abdoulaye Nombasi and hate speech in Congo. And he's a PhD candidate in Ghent University. And our third speaker, Jaiver Dialom, and he's going to speak on historical legacy confronting the past of Rohingya to the present. And he's the Chief Strategic Officer of Canada Rohingya Development Initiative, think tank and NGO based out of Ottawa, Canada. And we are very proud to present our today's moderator and discussant, Dr. Felix Mahinda, and he's from Tilburg University at Aegis. And we also have our host from Rotterdam University, Delphinathan Yoma, joining us in the whole session. And as we promised, we'll open up Q&A at the end of the session, and we'll invite question and answer sessions, those who have tuned in today from far apart. So without further ado, let me welcome Dr. Felix to take over the show and invite speakers to present. Dr. Felix, floor is yours. Unmute the mic, Felix. Unmute the mic. Yeah.
Of course, I have to unmute. So thank you very much for your very generous and kind introduction, Dr. Kauser Ahmed. Again, welcome everyone for this new session. I understand you have been already busy with quite a number of previous sessions where you explored again parallelly and both the connections and, if needed, the disconnections between these two separate, quite prima facie, very different as well, situations and contexts with differing dynamics, historical dynamics, but yet current similar challenges. I will be very brief in this very first part. My job, if it's very simple, is to pass the floor to the presenters in the order of listing. And of course, as a moderator, I will take carefully my notes and will be bouncing on some of the issues they will be raising during their presentations. And having, of course, worked most closely on the situation in Congo, in the Great Lakes region in general, I will definitely not miss making a few comments at the end of the presentations, also having worked on both collective victimization and hate speeches. With that in mind, I give the floor to Dr. Helen Hinges for the first presentation on, and as of course announced, her presentation on, and you can see that I'm trying not to make up things, on colonial legacies and present identity politics, where she will be comparing racism in two cases. Dr. Helen is, of course, from Erasmus University, mainly based at ISS. Dr. Helen, without further ado, the floor is yours. Dr. Helen, you are still muted.
Yes. Dr. Kaiser Ahmed, my it's still blocking my PowerPoint. I wonder if you could share it through your screen. It's my browser. And while we're waiting for that, I'd just like to thank Felix for his introduction and say that I'm going to try not to cover the same ground that's been covered in the last two seminars. So, for instance, Dr. Ortiz spoke about hate speech. I'm not going to get as far as that. And previously, we also heard quite a lot about Genocide Watch and their approach to genocide. I'm also not going to get into that today because it's been covered. But I'm hoping to look today a little bit at the history. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that's right. That's what I did as well. So what we have here are apparently, as Felix said, two cases which do not appear at first sight to be similar. And yet I'm going to show many parallels today. And today the emphasis is really on the similarities. I found many striking similarities. Just to give one example, I think we're in the wrong place. We've left the PowerPoint now. Okay, so one of the striking similarities which I actually found was that the date 1885 and 1884 are critical dates for both these countries, strangely enough, because the date 1885 is the cutoff date given for citizenship under a law that was introduced under Mobutu in Congo. But 1885 is also the date that Britain started to colonize Burma. And 1885 is also taken as the cutoff point there for various reforms in citizenship law. So that was one really interesting finding. And I think there's lots of other parallels. So perhaps if we can go to the second slide, I think I might have summed them up. Yeah, okay, so this is my puzzle at the beginning, is it is said, and it is true, and there is evidence that, in the past, the Rohingya lived with the Burmese, the rest of the Burmese, and the Banyamulenge lived with their neighbors in relative peace. Okay, I'm not saying in total harmony, but in relative peace. How did this change? And this is what I'm trying to look at as history, as an explanation of how things went wrong. And I came up really with two explanations, or two kinds of explanations. One is this historical categorization of people as autochthonous, as sons of the soil, presumably daughters as well, but usually sons. And then second thing I discovered across the two cases that's very similar is the divisive power of warfare. In the case of Burma, World War II, and in the case of Congo, the recent wars since '96. So we can go to the next slide if you like. Okay, I just want to say that the Banyamulenge situation, like the Rohingya situation, is not new. I'm not going to read out this letter in total, but I just want to note that this is a letter from 2001, but it could have been written last week because nothing has changed. It exactly describes the situation now, and it says at the end what we're also saying in these seminars: our appeal is to the international community, Amnesty International and other independent bodies, to wake up and save this innocent population from extinction. This was written in 2001. We can go to the next page. The Rohingya case is actually, even more clearly than the Banyamulenge case, a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. That comes from a report by the UN investigative team. And I think the interesting thing is that neither Rohingya nor Banyamulenge are classified as refugees, at least not in the camps in Cox's Bazar, and not within DRC. They're IDPs. And the consequence of that is that the UNHCR does actually not look after them. And that's also interesting because it's really not clear where people belong when they are stateless. So I've given a reference here. One of the most, I think, moving photographic efforts to document the situation of the Rohingya is this interactive link here from Al Jazeera, which shows 100 faces of Rohingya, everybody from age 3 to age 95. And it's. I think there should be something like this for the Banyamulenge as well. So I just put that there to say it's a very effective tool. Next slide, please. All right, this is a much more general point I'm making here about how colonial historiography rewrote ethnic relations. Now, this particular slide is not about the Banyamulenge, it's about Rwanda, but it illustrates very nicely, I think, how you go from the photograph on the left, where the height differences between people are actually quite minimal. You see what's called inverted commas Tutsi, inverted commas Hutu, inverted commas Twa, standing next to each other, and the differences are quite minimal. Look at the representation on the right from a Belgian school textbook. I mean, not only have the heights been stretched out and exaggerated, but the Twa, who is on the far right, is actually being brought forward and shrunk, whereas in the photograph, he's behind. And so his height is less, it's got partly to do with perspective. So I think that's an interesting example of how, colonial rule did not invent differences, but it did manipulate them. And that's also the case in Burma. So we can go to the next slide. In the case of Myanmar, we all know that a catastrophe unfolded in 2017. And I just wanted to highlight that, unlike with the Banyamulenge, there has been a very huge and massive effort to understand what went wrong. And I think some of the lessons we could look at maybe in the next seminar or in general are, why were the signs not picked up? This has also been asked over and over again about the Rwanda genocide itself. Why was the evidence ignored? And here's a suggestion from the UN itself that in future, when there are diverse interpretations, as we've seen in the case of both Banyamulenge and Rohingya, both interpretations should be shared system-wide, and the logic of each should be really seriously looked at instead of choosing one. So that's that slide. Thank you. So who are these unwanted people who just do not fit in? In this case, we're talking about the Rohingya and the Banyamulenge, but we could equally be talking about the Uyghurs in China, or we could be talking about African Americans, frankly, or the Batwa in the whole Great Lakes region, or the Maasai in East Africa, or indigenous Americans across the whole southern and northern continent, Indian Muslims, or Aboriginals in Australia. So these are all, at least some of the unwanted people. Another massive category of unwanted people today is actually refugees. So since the Second World War, we've said never again, never again. Since Rwanda, we've said never again, never again. Unfortunately, it just seems to happen again and again. So next slide. So what did the Belgians do? I have a stake in this because my dad was a Belgian diplomat at one time, and I have a bone to pick with the Belgians in Congo. What the Belgians actually did was they consistently considered the Kinyarwanda speakers in the Congo, what was then the colony, as foreigners. So this started quite some time ago, this tendency to alienate a group of the population. Something very similar can be seen in the case of Rohingya in this video, which I've put here, but which we won't click at the moment because of time. So this video actually shows David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, going to Burma and for the first time meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi, the liberated leader of the country, but also meeting the Rohingya. And since Aung San Suu Kyi refused to say the word Rohingya, his action was seen as significant by Tun Kin, who's the UK spokesperson for the Rohingya. So this was in 2012, and the article says clearly, or the video says clearly, Rohingya are not seen as citizens of Burma. So again, the othering is very much common, and the ex-colonial power and the colonial power are involved in both cases. This is the root of not being accepted as autochthonous. Right. Delphin introduced me to this through his thesis. The study by Weiss, which Delphin I haven't read, but which I must read, dates Banyamulenge settlement, and this is in the book by Turner, 2007, on Congo Myth and Reality. He dates Banyamulenge settlement just before the Berlin Conference, literally like 1880 or something. He describes it as if they just got in the nick of time. Now that's contested, because others would say the Banyamulenge were there from the 1700s or the 1800s. So again, it's not an agreed date, but they were certainly there before 1884. In terms of Burma, it's actually even clearer that in 1885, when the British colonized the country, the Rohingya had claims to have lived there since the 13th or even the 9th century. So that is a massive difference in terms of pre-existing settlement. But both the British and the Belgians moved people around. So they just moved people around willy-nilly because like Rwanda was full and they had to get some space for Rwandan workers and so on and so forth. Actually, pastoralists went as well as workers. And in fact, both the British and the Belgians confused the situation by moving a lot of migrant workers back and forth across the borders. Don't forget, Belgium had trusteeship, inverted commas, over Rwanda, Urundi, and Britain was colonizing both Burma and the country next door, Bangladesh. So these two countries made chaos by moving people around. And that's also an origin of the myth that both the Banyamulenge and the Rohingya are recent arrivals. It's simply not true, but the pattern of colonial labor migration, made it credible to claim that they were recent arrivals, because some were. Yeah, next slide. And this is the second factor. So the first factor was autochthony. And the fact is, even if we agree when people arrived, that doesn't seem to solve the problem. And maybe this is why. The dynamic of warfare sets up ethnic polarization to such an extent that identities start to be seen as incompatible. And there's two very, I think, comparable situations in the two cases that we're looking at. In the Second World War, Buddhist Burmese forces joined with the Japanese, and Britain was ousted from the country in 1942 and didn't return till 1945. I think these facts are quite well known. The Rohingya in the Second World War decided to go with the Allies. They did not join the Burmese forces with the Japanese. And so when British rule was restored in 1945, with the help of Rohingya, it's as if the whole Burmese population felt betrayed. We can see almost the same dynamic in the case of the DRC, what is now the DRC, because after the genocide in Rwanda, Rwanda became involved in Eastern DRC. That's one way of putting it. There were many interventions, and in some of those interventions, some of the Banyamulenge joined the Rwandan forces. So you can see already that in both cases, the minority group that is now targeted is viewed as allies of the so-called invading country, whether it's Britain or in this case, whether it's Rwanda, which has kind of taken on a surrogate role as a colonizer in Eastern Congo, which is interesting. And these wars generated ideas, fixed ideas that also drew on race history of the colonizers of irreconcilable differences. So we can go to the next slide. So these are just some more facts. The ID cards were withdrawn from Rohingya. And similarly, in Zaire, the law was changed to deprive Banyamulenge and Banyarwanda of nationality and citizenship. So this happened repeatedly and then was never actually officially implemented in the case of Zaire. I mean, I cannot find any single image of a Congolese ID document being taken away or on Google Images. I could find hundreds of Rohingya examples of cards that were removed and replaced with cards that said not citizens. The Rohingya are known as the most persecuted people in the world. I would agree at the moment that's probably right, but we mustn't forget other persecuted peoples. Doesn't mean that they have to be a million of them or 2 million of them to be persecuted. In the case of the Uyghurs, there are 1 or 2 million. They're in China and they're extremely persecuted. So I think it's a bit dangerous to say the most persecuted people in the world. I think there's so many commonalities to persecuted people that we should stick together. Okay. So many parallels, terrible conditions in the camps, funds allocated well below requirements, both for the Banyamulenge IOM camp in Cox's Bazar and nothing available for the Rohingya camp in Cox's Bazar is well below allocation levels. So they've got a huge shortfall every year in what's promised and what's allocated. So there's no safety either for the Rohingya in their camp. There's no safety for the Banyamulenge in the centres where they've been forced to move to. There's growing hostility in both contexts, both in Bangladesh and Myanmar and in the DRC and in the neighbouring countries towards the minorities as well. And actually the basic right to food is in danger. And there's a huge amount of gender-based violence and trauma in both cases, which is completely undealt with. In both cases, also, the regional dynamics are critical to understanding how these people are being sacrificed to much broader regional interests. For example, the road that China is building through Rakhine State, or the geopolitical interests of countries in the Great Lakes. So I finish with this. This is an image, obviously, from the Second World War, where people literally were lulled into a false sense of security. That is the Jews, the gypsies, the homosexuals, the political opponents, the communists. They were all lulled into a false sense of security and then basically eliminated. And this is what we're seeing today. So we really haven't learned. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I wanted to quote this because I had a long discussion after last seminar with Janos. Is it Janos Cooperman? Yeah. Anyway, and in the end, I was quite disturbed by what he said, how he couldn't decide whether the Banyamulenge situation was a genocide or not. He felt maybe it wasn't, etc., etc. And I sent him this because I felt that this expresses much more clearly than I can why I think it's important to call something what it is and to say that it's a genocide rather than saying, well, you know, I'm not sure. And I did get quite annoyed with him last week, but we had our discussion and we've kind of resolved our differences, but I don't think I'm going to convince him. But this is Elie Wiesel, who's a genocide survivor, and he's written one of the best books on the Holocaust called The Night. And this was something he said during his Nobel Prize speech. I'm not going to read it out, but maybe the main thing he says is that silence encourages the tormentor and never the tormented. And sometimes we must interfere. And for him, he says, where human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. The situation must become the center of the universe. I mean, it's a very extreme thing to say, but I think it's justified in the case of genocide. So is it all hopeless? Now here I am going to ask you to click on one of the video links. This may seem very superficial, but I have been doing a little bit of homework on what's been going on under COVID. And something quite extraordinary can occasionally happen. I think it's not a hopeless situation. I think we have to do everything we can. That's mainly the politics of hope, doing everything you can. Try to draw the world's attention to all today's minorities, and Black Lives Matter is very much part of that. And I think the Black Lives Matter trope can be mobilized, certainly in Congo. I think, you know, in the case of Rohingya, all lives matter. And what we need to also show that whatever states do to minorities will not improve their situation. They can destroy all the minorities in the world, but there's no way that they're going to avoid climate change, economic meltdown, or COVID. So we should be investing our time and energy in getting connections going for global solidarity between minorities. And I think this seminar series is at least a start in that direction. And I think we can probably do more on that score. And I want to show something which is an example of global solidarity. And the reason I want to show it is because it gives us hope. And I think we'll go to the second video, if you don't mind.
Helen, there was a text in the margins from Dr. Caisse Ahmed suggesting to watch the video at the end.
No worries, that's fine. I agree. So I hope I haven't taken too long. Sorry if I have, and thanks very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, and I suspect that you have all given a round of virtual applause to Dr. Helen. Thank you very much for your very difficult task, as I said, of bringing some parallels between these two very contrasted situations by looking both in terms of history, what are the key moments in history that kind of triggered marginalization, what are the dynamics, like, for example, quite very telling, the fact that the Rohingya did side with the occupying power, the existing power at the moment, when the state, the parent state, did side with the invading Japanese occupant, and during the World Wars, and of course the ideas in Eastern Congo as well from the 60s, but which can also even be brought back to this. We talked about the 90s, but ideas also can go back to the 60s during the rebellion, the Simba rebellion. With that in mind, before I make more comments, I'll move swiftly to the second presentation by Jean-Pierre, and he will be talking about hate speech, the origin of, not much the origin, but one key moment in hate speech in the Congo, and through a revisiting of the dynamics around the Abdoulaye Ndombasi case, which was brought before Belgian courts. But much of what I know is that much of the law schools do teach about the ruling of the International Court of Justice. Can someone mute their? Yeah, there are some people who are still. Yeah, thank you very much. So I know that from many international law schools, they do teach something about that case around the immunity of, let's say, officials like foreign affairs ministers in vis-a-vis allegations of crimes against humanity. In that particular case, the International Court of Justice in The Hague did hold in favor of Ndombasi. Jean-Pierre will tell us more about that maybe later. But what I found interesting, I studied that, I think, in 2004 or 5 in a master class in human rights. But we said absolutely nothing, during the course, we said absolutely nothing about the substance of that particular case. What is the case actually, beyond the legalistic kind of formulas about immunity or not immunity, what did actually happen? That doesn't transpire in the case when you read. And the background to the case, therefore, gets very much lost in legal technicalities. With that in mind, let's hear more about that background from Jean-Pierre. The floor is yours. And probably might be an idea to unmute yourself, Jean-Pierre.
Okay. So thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, you told me to combine two topics, hate speech and one specific case. So, but I will try. But I hope hate speech more. The current Dr. Felix has done much work on that. Maybe he will elaborate more on that after my presentation. I will leave him like few minutes because he did current research on that. But the origin of the hate speech, as Dr. Helen have presented, I can also go back to the colonial period for the Banyamulenge. This is like have a link. He mentioned the Tana. Tana said that why the colonial rule suppressed the chieftaincies of the Banyamulenge is because the Banyamulenge were reputed to be uncooperative with the colonial rule, Belgian colonial rule. Weiss also went far and said that the Banyamulenge refused to pay taxes, to participate in the population census. even he went very far and said that the Banyamulenge threatened to reduce the influence of Europeans in eastern of Congo, even in Congo. So they are written. And from that, their chieftaincies were suppressed. Professor Mbonyinkhebe, who is an anthropologist, he said that they also opposed the land policy of colonizers, which emphasized on agriculture, and Tutsi and Banyamulenge are farmers with the cows, so they also opposed that. And from that, Belgium decided to suppress their chieftaincies. And until now, power at the local level in DRC is mono-ethnically defined. This is why there are chieftaincies of Bafulero, Babembe, and what. And from that, other Congolese say that, so Banyamulenge are not Congolese because they don't have chieftains, a traditional power. This has been decided or defined by Belgian colonial rule. But go very quickly to the Erodia case. First, who is Erodia himself? After Laurent Desire Kabila took power in Kinshasa, they removed Mobutu. One of his minister, Ndombasi was at the time, was the private secretary and the director of his cabinet, or presidential cabinet at the time. And when the war erupted in Congo, quickly the Kabila regime accused the Tutsi or the Banyamulenge to have to collaborate with foreign forces to destabilize the country. This was main reason first that they gave after that. But when this war erupted, there was many discussions. Those who took the guns against Kabila, their argument was they are opposing a new dictatorship in Congo, because when Kabila took power, started to rule with member of his community, Balubakati of Katanga. So this was, and they said, no, we cannot agree with this style of governance. This was their argument. But also in eastern of Congo, there was the Mai Mai, which are there from a long time, has already started to attack the Banyamulenge villages and North Kivu and South Kivu and raiding their cattle. This was also another insecurity situation which was prevailing in eastern of Congo before the outbreak of the war. The other thing was this, what they call the Hamite Tutsi Empire conspiracy theories, which was moving in the region at the level where even the President Kabila was had difficulties to manage even the Tutsi who were in the army and in the government, because people were seeing them as foreigners. I'm trying to tell you the situation which was there before the outbreak of the war. So when the war started, the government of Kabila went just mobilize social media, national television. So Erodia appeared as private secretary of the cabinet of president.
Of course, as you know, we are now in a new space, let's say, conference rooms, during which you can get domestic interruptions. But I trust that Jean-Pierre is promptly back, which is the case now. So Jean-Pierre, back to you.
Sorry. We at home, and my child came just in the room. Yeah. So at the time, Abdoulaye Robi and Ndombasi just came to the television and called members of other Congolese community and to exterminate the Tutsi, where he called them as scum and vermin to eradicate methodically and by all means. This this was the speech on national television. And also, yeah, the President Kabila also appeared on the television with the same manipulation, with the same speeches. His Minister of Information, Didier Mumengi, also even appeared with a machete on the television. So following these speeches, people were killed since Kinshasa in front of international media. People were killed in other places in the province, like in Katanga, in Lubumbashi, in Viura, and other places in Congo following these speeches. So what happened from that? Victims, it is clear that the victims could not get like the right to introduce their cases in domestic jurisdiction because the high-ranking authorities in the country were involved in this kind of mobilization and hate speech. So those who managed to reach Belgium, some victims brought the case in Belgian courts because Belgium had a law on universal jurisdiction, allowing them to prosecute even international crimes committed out of Belgium if victims are on Belgian soil. So what happened? They introduced the case and they did investigation. And the first instance tribunal of Brussels issued an arrest warrant against Erodia. But what happened during that time, Erodia was quickly removed from the Secretary Cabinet of the President to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which means that at the time of accusation, he was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So what Congo did was to protect him from his criminal prosecution. Congo accused directly Belgium of violating diplomatic immunity of his sitting Minister of Foreign Affairs. It's what happened. So, and the case went the egg, as Felix said, this was diplomatic immunity, and the ICJ, International Court of Justice, decided in favor of the immunity of Erodia. But he added, the ICJ added two clauses. He said that to prosecute, in order this case to proceed in Belgium, unless Congo remove or revoke with the immunity of Erodia, which was impossible. Second, the ICJ said that, but this decision does not prevent Congo to prosecute Erodia in national jurisdiction. So this was the motivation of the ICJ. And this was again not possible because Congo had taken steps to prevent the continuation of that case in Belgium. What happened, he was a Minister of Foreign Affairs and they knew that maybe he could be bothered in his movement. He was quickly again moved to Minister of Education. So when the ICJ rendered this decision as he can be prosecuted in national courts, again, Congo moved him to a senator, and senator had immunity to be prosecuted by national jurisdiction in Congo. That was the obstruction that Congo did, was to obstruct the continuation of the case in other forums of jurisdiction outside Congo and even within Congo. This is what happened. Why all this? Because, of course, the Banyamulenge or the Tutsi were unwanted people. So for them, that was not a problem to kill them. So this is why they protected Erodia. So the side of Congo was to protect a perpetrator of international crimes rather than providing effective remedy for victims of international crimes, either in national jurisdiction and outside Congo. So this is what happened. So the case really, for me, was like how hate speech are devastative, like hate speech, the consequences of hate speech, because after this hate speech, people were killed countrywide in Congo. This is one. Second is the role of the governments, some government authorities in Congo, in this conflict which targets Banyamulenge or other Tutsi in Congo because of their origin. they played really a key role in obstructing this case, the continuation in Belgium. So this was the case. I didn't go to diplomatic immunity because my role was to clarify that the hate speech, the consequences, and what was the move of the government to react. So if I see that the hate speech, what they did to characterize Banyamulenge as vermins is like they have dehumanized them, like they are not people, they are like something everyone can. This is one characteristics of hate speech, is dehumanizing, like they are not people, they are things, scum. And this happens also to Rwanda. They were called, Tutsi were called like insect inyenzi. So this what happened also in Rwanda in the genocide of the killing of Tutsi. So this is one things hate speech bring, and the hate speech also fuel the conflicts in countries like in Congo. And last time Dr. Orso said also it's a suppression tool, hate speech, it's a suppression tool, because it calls people to kill others. So going very quickly to the current hate speeches in Congo, I was like surprised when I heard the speech of the president last week, stopping like suspending the Minembwe commune where many Banyamulenge lives. He said that is to protect Congolese people, which was good, but he said mostly ours, le mien. Le mien, who is ours and who is not his people, who is his people and who is not his people. And he added again, like the demarcation of this territory will be done in collaboration with natives. The same as Dr. Ellen said, who are natives and who are not natives. And the president insisted again in that situation. This was things I was just, I followed that, and some kind of divisive speech of the president. This is my opinion. This is my opinion. So the current hate speech against the Banyamulenge in Congo has also some commonalities. So as they are choose to be foreigners from Rwanda who invaded their land, they came to occupy their land, which means that they have to vacate by all means in the whole plateau, either live or dead. This is some of the messages that I think Felix will tell us more. And again, they accuse them to be behind what they call balkanization process. Like they are working on behalf of other countries. You can guess which countries they say. So, and people are just proliferating this kind of speeches like the Banyamulenge, people living in the rural areas. It happens also once, I remember for the Bemba Banyamulenge case in The Hague. So Banyamulenge were living like very far kilometers. Now they say they went to Central Africa to kill people. Felix also did some research on that. So there are kind of manipulation, but which are the result of hate speech, which has been for a long time tolerated like by the government in Congo. The other thing I can say, this hate speech are proliferated by people of different kind, like Fayulu is candidates. He was presidential candidate. His speeches, he said that Minembwe is occupied by foreigners and by what and what. Politicians, Honore Ngwanda, they are politicians, people of high level, religious, Catholic Church, how it is in Rwanda. So a bishop of Uvira, if a bishop says something, which means that you have subsistence, people will follow. So which means a category of people like they are involved in this kind of hate speeches. But I hope Felix will explain, elaborate more on that because they did a specific research on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, at a very exact time when I was about to do the not right thing of trying to tell you to round up. Thank you very much. I don't know what is appropriate now. Of course, I mean, as I said, I have done some work on this, but probably is it better that I go? Let me add maybe comments here since it's the same topic. Then I go to before I go to the next topic because it makes more sense. If I didn't my facilitating position. I like to start a little bit more broad. Of course, Ellen did part of one thing that I wanted to do, which is to show the colonial kind of source of many of the issues that we have today in the Eastern DRC. I did a recent presentation on that, and I tend to see 4 different things that are existing today in conflicts, which can be connected back to the colonization. The first thing was that when Belgium got to Congo and many other powers there, they did what is known as the racialization of identity, something Helen covered. And they translated that into governance institutions through the tools of recognition and legitimization, or delegitimization for that matter. And in doing so, they did fix, and that's the third point, they did fix pre-existing boundaries between entities, but also between people, and those boundaries, in most cases in African communities, tended to be quite very flexible or quite pretty much almost inexistent. Where one kingdom started or ended, or where population started and ended, there's a lot of literature on that. Was quite very much more porous than it became fixed. And the fourth has to do then when how that came to be translated into citizenship. And citizenship then, as it is today, it lives today in a country like Congo, has to do with both authentic citizenship, which is translated into ethnic citizenship, before you start talking about anything about national belonging or national identity. So in that sense, that legacy is pretty much present in narratives of hate speech that you have today, but also in the whole dispute and contestations that you have around the community in Emboi. Now, in 2016, I did a study on collective victimization and subjectivity, which is one of the reasons why I had quite a heated conversation some given time ago with Delphin. When we are talking about victimization in Eastern Congo, and with, of course, the current focus on the Banyamulenge, I like always to take a step back, first of all, and say that victimization is a very complex phenomenon, of course. In a country like the DRC, I think many people have read something about DRC and victimization. Probably many would be more familiar with King Leopold's
Felix,
the discussion that is going.
You're breaking up. I think you've got a problem. You're not next to your microphone, so we actually can't hear half of what you're saying.
Oh, that's very terrible. So let me rewind. Is this better now? I'm getting it closer. Yeah. So I hope it's better. So it's probably because also I was switching with screens. So when I'm talking about collective victimization in DRC, and in a country and a context where there is a lot of emotionalism that pretty much dominates much of the rationality, there's always a need a little bit to take a step back. And the step back that I want to take, which I did take in that article of 2016, is that when you're talking about victimization, we need to look at time and space. So if you take the whole spectrum with the background I gave with the link to Colonial, the period, I mean, already from the Congo Free State, there was quite a lot of collective victimization. I mean, Adam Hochschild, King Leopold Ghost, speaks of 10 million people killed at the time. That's one. Second, since the 60s, there has been always a conflict in the DRC. So the 90s, of course, and until now. So the DRC has been a continuation of the conflicts. So anyone who tries to put a boundary between when things did start actually tends to make an artificial boundary. There have been just an addition of different factors of conflictuality that took place. And within that landscape, then, quite the entire Congolese population has been victimized, not in the same way, but victimized, simply because Congo has lacked governance since it exists. from the colonial time, it was the only African territory which belonged to a person rather than to a country. And from the 60s, of course, Mobutu's autocratic rule, there has always been a center and very many peripheries where lawlessness rules. And in that context, quite a lot of communities have been victimized. But the specificity of the Banyamulenge and other Congolese, the Tutsi, like in North Kivu, the Banyarwanda, is that they are killed because of that existing chaotic landscape of absence of strong government, but also they are killed and specifically targeted because of whom they are under these narratives of not belonging to the Congolese citizenship, not being included, as Helen, but also Jean-Pierre did talk about. And within that landscape, within the landscape also connected to the colonial order, the colonial identities, the colonial governance institutions, the colonial citizenship, and the boundaries of that, you have a lot of things that have developed. They have actually also grown from colonization. Like has also to do with the narratives around Bantus versus Nilotics. Anywhere there were Nilotics didn't belong. In fact, for that matter, if you look at colonial historiography, Nilotics don't belong to Africa. They are Asians. They came from Asia. They went through the Nile Valley, then permeated the rest of the region. But their origin is somewhere in Asia. They don't belong. The true African is a Negro Bantu. That's the historiography that you have in colonial books. And because of that alterity created at the time of the colonization, you have, of course, the Banyamulenge and the Congolese society of Kivu, who have always been legitimized as not belonging to Congolese territory, regardless of whatever the nationality laws of a given time might say. With that in mind, that's what you find then in hate speech today. I did very quickly, I'm not presented here, I did a recent study where I looked at social media, nearly all of social media. I looked at different themes. I visited hundreds of videos and audio messages shared on social media, analyzed them in different languages, and I found, more or less, working also with a colleague, we found a few thematic kind of things which tend to come back in delegitimizing or in othering the Banyamulenge in the Congolese context. And the first is that precisely as Jean-Pierre already alluded to, the Banyamulenge are not Tutsis. The Banyamulenge are not Tutsis. The Banyamulenge are not Congolese. They are Tutsis, and Tutsis belong to Rwanda, not Congo. And that's where they should be sent back. And we have many quotes in the narratives. Many people who are in like social media have seen a lot of such texts. They are not Congolese. They are Rwandans, and Rwandans, of course, are not from Congo. They are from Rwanda, and they should be sent back there. The second key theme has to do with the fact that they are greedy, and their ambitions is to control Congolese land and establish Congo and the Tutsi-Hima Empire. That is already not new at all, because that already was a narrative in hate media in Rwanda before 1994, because also the Tutsi had already at that time. One of the prominent things it was published in a very hate speech, the renowned magazine Kangura, which was subject to ICTR prosecution, and the publisher now is in jail for that, where this conspiracy was so-called conspiracy of which basically is more or less the equivalent in the Great Lakes region, the equivalent of the protocol of wise men of Zion for the Jews conspiracies. Apparently, the Tutsis have always wanted to control that area and establish an empire which stretches more or less from Ethiopia. The boundaries always, shift, but it goes from Ethiopia to all of the Great Lakes region. So that is the second. So their presence are part of serving this ambition, which is purportedly already existent. The third has to do with the fact that, in fact, that is happening already since the Banyamulenge live in Congo. So they are already the Trojan horse there inside the country, and the occupation is the actual occurrence. So if you read, the unsuccessful presidential contender in 2018, Martin Fayulu, did just issue a statement yesterday, yes, where he basically states that they need to get rid of occupants. Minembwe is under occupation, and the natives need to get rid of the occupants. So Congo is already under occupation. Even the government acts under the influence of the occupants. And another key thing, of course, is that the Banyamulenge and the Tutsis.
Felix.
So yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
First of all, we can't hear you. because you keep cutting out. I'm sorry to say this, but just hear properly. And, yeah.
That's terrible. That's okay. I'm back. That's really terrible because that is happening. I think every time that I switch to some of my notes on my side. So I'm not going to do that. So the third, and I'll be stopping there. Maybe the fourth. I guess that was the fourth. Was that the Banyamulenge are manipulative? Everything they manipulate the locals and end up getting their lands and their territories. And of course, being deceitful again, all of those are attributes already that were very prominently present in the Rwandan context during the genocide of the Tutsi, actually before the genocide of the Tutsi. And those were acts, actually the publication that influenced people to look at the Tutsi in the context of Rwanda at the time as these evil snakes, vermin, manipulative evilness of theirs in order to target them as a legitimate target for the killings. So we are now already from the literature on dehumanization. So these themes, so there are some specific themes that are proper to the Banyamulenge, of course, given their context, but quite a lot of them are borrowed from
Dr. Felix.
already the Rwandan context at the time, and already an understanding of this common threat. Yes?
You are again cutting out. So, and we have the next speaker. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. With that in mind, so, I think I even took long enough to stop here now and indeed invite the next speaker and to give. So, Javed, sorry for my interrupted kind of rumbling now. So, with that in mind, we switch from the Congolese landscape to the Rohingya / the region, Bangladesh, of course, also since that identity tends now to be to be put in question by those who persecuted the Rohingya now. So the floor is yours now to enlighten us with the context. And your topic, of course, is around the historical legacy confronting the past of the Rohingyas to the present. The floor is yours, Javed.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Koser, for keeping this study consistent on a, usually we see this sort of like engagement or this sort of discussions resurface to the media whenever there is some newsworthy triggers, like be it a capsized boat or be it a clearance operations, be it or some sort of tragedy, then it resurfaces to the media, then it's kind of dive back in, and these patterns have been repeating for the last, as far as I know, and it's almost became like a trend. So thank you for keeping the work, and thank you for keeping it consistency. And while we kind of see these tragedies and this sort of clearance operations, ethnic cleansing to genocide as a trend, on the other hand, from the perpetrator side, or the regimes who usually carried out the genocide and other brutal clearance operations, it is not so much of a trend. It is most of the time a very pretty consistent effort. There is no such ups and downs. It is the atrocities were usually carried on a consistent level. Sometimes it is soft on the psychological frontier, very subtle institutional changes with very long-term damaging consequences. On the other side, it is physical violence or physical operation. And that's when we get the attention. That's when the world it grabbed the world's attentions, but the soft changes or the psychological or institutional changes usually do not capture international community's attention. So I think I'll put a little bit of touch on what usually goes unnoticed, or at least in the case of Rohingya, what went unnoticed, which didn't caught international media's attention, but has rather bigger implications or harsher implications. And as Dr. Helen touched a few points, I think I'll come back to a few of that, including the people passing to both sides of the border and on. Yeah, that's the point that I'll touch on. Firstly, the changes that are often not caught in the international media attentions, and what it meant to be Rohingyan in the past, which the generations of mine and the younger generations completely forgot. Today, in a time where the word Rohingya, just the name of the race, was what even not allowed in the Burmese media, it is worth to remind, or it is worth to remembering that the Rohingyan were held like both elected and unelected public offices. There were Rohingyan student union in universities, and there were slots allocated in the national radio for Rohingya languages. So what happened from such a situation to today, where you cannot even utter the name of Rohingya in any Burmese media, as Dr. Helen mentioned, but a lot of international media and international leaders and Burmese leaders insist that people do not use the word Rohingya. And I have come across several media who were sanctioned for barely using the name Rohingya. And there are a few international media, which I wouldn't name, but held both international news outlet and Burmese news outlet for the same news article, for the same event. When they present to international media, the word became Rohingya, and when it was presented to the Burmese audience, it is twisted and often poke around, whether it is by the label that the government want to put arbitrarily with Bengali, or just in generalized as a Muslim. So to go back all the way into why such a situations of like a student unionism presents in the radio to National Student Union to the word we cannot utter, I would go not too far, but as far as like where you can traceable or where it is documented until the 13th century. When the first British arrived and kind of started colonizing, like the border, where it is worth to remember the border were not as solidly defined as today. So there were some sort of movements, and there might be some sort of mingling, and it is not just one way or the other way, it could be both way. But there are also the majority of the regions are not accessible to the other side due to just bare geographical barrier. So it is not that the whole was mingled, the whole population of Rohingya was mingled or brought by British in the first place, as the Burmese media would like to put, or as the Burmese governments insist that the media put in. So it is like a very tiny fractions that has a possibility of mingling on the both sides. But this was used due to the fact that the Rohingya resembles more to the South Asian than the Burmese. This was used by Burmese nationalists, from the very grassroots level to all the way to nationalist chamber. This is used as an excuse to resemble them as a migrants, and the Rohingya were often used as a black sheep whenever they need you need an excuse to incite a violence. And this have been repeating from since then until to the very last wave of 2012. Whenever they are needed, the Rohingya were used as an excuse to execute certain violence or to carry on certain violence. But again, as I said, the violence and these physical operations do get public attention, do get international media attention. What is happening on the below the surface, or what is happening on the psychological and institutional changes, where since after Burma got independent and falling into the military coup in 1962, there were subtle changes that were not very widely known to the outside of Burmese governments or military community. For example, the subtle changes that started, I would say, like expelling any Rohingya from public office. And gradually over time, there is no Rohingya representations in the system, in any institutions or in any public office. Then there came the subtle changes of restricting in educations. The restriction educations was so subtle that at first it was only tier 1 university, which is in Burma, usually the School of Aeronautics, Medical, Law to naval schools. The first restrictions came as a wave of restrictions on Rohingya students to go to tier 1 university. Then it calmed down to tier 2 university, which is in any sort of a STEM or applied sciences. And the restrictions was reduced based to like Rohingya students only going to tier 3 university, which is the lowest tier, where you basically have liberal arts. And the latest restrictions came in was Burmese Rohingya students were not even allowed to go into the tier 3 university or at all. This is like such a subtle restrictions carried over decades. It is not surprising that it didn't caught any attention. And usually these sort of restrictions came in without much announcement or without much physical or without much official announcement. So it is too subtle to pick up by the international communities or communities that are media that are not present on the ground. And the close nature of the Burmese government suddenly didn't help. But that was not the only one. There were healthcare restrictions, and the final blow was, I think, restrictions on the movement, which is you cannot go out of approximately 3 square miles where you were born to. And if you want to go, you need to get a permission. And the restrictions on movement was the broadest scope that kind of, if you cannot move, you cannot go to access healthcare, you cannot go to schools, you cannot go to find a job that's where you were born. So this was like an encompassing restrictions. Then even within that 3 square miles, the net restrictions came in as if restrictions on the marriage, restrictions the number of kids you can have. Then as the militaries goes, starting from 1962, the textbooks were rewritten, and there was no real presentations of history, whatever. It is mostly propaganda influence narratives that were being put. And with that, the history of Rohingya was completely eliminated from any sort of presence in print, I would say. Prior to 1962 to all the way to today, like Burmese citizenship was pretty much based on blood. If you're born into the citizens, you automatically inherit citizens. But what happened in the 1982 was there was a slight twist in the citizenship law where it is no longer the blood based. Now you need to belong to a race, which was again arbitrarily defined. I'm pretty sure, as far as my ethnic friends, nobody's happy the way they were labeled. These are like arbitrary level of ethnic being enforced on them. And the slight twist that came into the 1982 citizenship law was you not only need to be children of citizens, both, you also need to belong to a race. And then the Rohingyas were purposefully eliminated from this race category of like 135 arbitrarily defined, which often changes. So at the time, it wasn't picked up, I would say, by any legal expert or by any international communities. It was just a subtle change, but over time, this probably has the biggest implications or the harshest measures that were taken. For example, my grandparents and even my mom's level were inherited citizenship, but when it come to me, it wasn't the case anymore. And there are some extreme cases where just for using the citizenship, the national ID, it was confiscated and replaced without any consents or without any explanations. Most of the time, these are like military law, like you are not supposed to question, or if you do question, then you end up in jail, obviously. So my point is, most of the time, it is the subtle change, the subtle institutional changes that were taken under the surface or under internal order that has the biggest implications in the long run. And as UN were saying, UN and other reports were saying, this is a very textbook examples of genocide. And I wonder why such clues were not picked up. And the absence of international communities or the close nature of the Burmese government, Burmese regime, and the close media, the closing of international media to the in the country was not a valid excuse to my view, because UN has been there, and as far as I know, UN maintained their physical office like in the most remote part of the conflict area, and yet it is not reasonable, or it's not plausible, like to say these changes, these cues were not picked up. It is clearly well known, but it seems like the world give more attention whenever their physical presence, but the attention should suddenly be given to subtle institutional changes that has longer implications and probably harsher mean that define the whole genocide, or that take the roots in the genocide. To compare that to wrap up, or to compare that to the presence, was like we're at a time, for example, COVID, where you you suddenly need the help of a state to get services that is only provided by a state. And to travel, you need some sort of ID or some sort of passport that only a state could provide you. And being a stateless in a time where you need this state for the basic survivals, like to get COVID treatments, these changes were rooted in the eliminations of citizenship or in the elimination of races that were taken roots in the institutional changes, but not the physical or violence operations. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David, for your, let's say, travel through history of this process of, let's say, othering of the Rohingyas within the Burmese, the Myanmar state. I find it quite fascinating, of course, not being an expression on your country. I find it quite fascinating, this idea that with the new citizenship law of 90s, citizenship came to be defined in relation.
And your voice is cutting off, and it's quite difficult to hear what you're saying.
That's tragic. I'm going to now try to speak up. I have tried to. Can you hear me now?
I do, but it's often quite goes back.
All right. I guess I was saying how fascinating it was to learn about let's say the defining of citizenship in relation to race in the 21st century. I mean, that was the end of 20th century, but in the 21st century, still applicable, I would suspect. That law is still applicable, I guess. And race being also, anthropologically, at least we know today that this whole idea of race is something very contested. So the fact that they still use that even in a law, I find it quite tragically fascinating. The same way, actually, which draws a parallel quite very interestingly so to the Congolese landscape, where citizenship is defined in relation to tribes. And tribes, again, in anthropology today, is a very contested word, because tribes were these peoples or nations which were still in a stage of evolution, but still that word is very much used with very current currency within the Congolese landscape. Quite tragically fascinating to learn about these differences and the processes of othering. With that in mind, having taken too much time, we go to the question and answers before we go to a video at the end, which Helen had promised us. And we had already a first question from, and I'm going to be not mispronounce words, Orthi, who had already a question and comments about also hate speech, including in the Burmese case. So we are kind of very much, we have pressure on time. Quick intervention, Orthi, and that, we'll go to general questions and it will be fed to us by Caisse. The floor is yours, Ovi.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me again. And as those of you who follow the webinar know that I already spoke on hate speech circulation on social medias. Today, I just want to go over a few of the facts, and because to be very honest, I didn't get much time to prepare my speech or my facts straight. So I was looking forward to hear from the panelists. So what I wanted to add to this discussion is that the most important fact we wanted to focus, we should focus on is that Myanmar was for a long time cut off from the rest of the world since 2019, after the military government handed over the power to the civilian government. A process of opening up the country began really. So internet was the first time allowed into the country with widespread access without very little moderation. So for some people, that time or the Facebook was the internet really. They didn't know any other users of the internet other than the Facebook. So as far as I know, Facebook had only 2 Burmese speaking content moderators, and thus the content moderation system was completely inept. So as Myanmar citizens were unable to deal with this kind of information, it contributed toward the demonization of Rohingya. So, and to be very honest, I mean, there were rumors in 2017, like the military's intelligence arm spread rumors on Facebook to both Muslim and the Buddhist groups that an attack from other side was imminent, right? Like it spread warnings in Facebook messengers via widely followed accounts masquerading as news sites and celebrity fan pages that jihad attacks would be carried out. So to Muslim groups, it spread a separate message that the nationalist Buddhist monks were organizing anti-Muslim protesters. So, sorry, my video was off. I didn't notice that. So after that, now we should also know a fact in this case, and I wanted to add very little. I don't want to just add some jargon data in here. It's like that we should also know that a fact that while we are analyzing the social media's role in spreading hate speech, we are overlooking some other important contributing factors to the landscape of extreme speech that exist in countries like Myanmar, or in case of DRC, like such as how the state officials and the state media had the negative consequences of extreme speeches, like newspapers like Global New Light of Myanmar in this case. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add in this discussion. And there are other reports where we can see few numbers, like the a researcher from the Institute of War and Peace who carried out a 2-year anti-hate speech project in Myanmar that lasted until July 2017. Social media platforms such as Facebook were inundated with hateful propaganda messages, as Javed told earlier, that most of which were based on unfounded information and fake news, like propaganda account of various coming out of various places within Myanmar. And they found photos of these signs on Facebook being shared and appalled by users who urged their own communities to take note and follow suit. And this propaganda actually, like a study from the date June 2016 to on I'm sorry, I forgot the date, but I guess it was August 24 and 25 when the Facebook posts actually spiked in Facebook when ARSA attacked security forces, prompting those security forces to launch the clearance operation. And I think that's why the hate speech circulation, or when we are talking about conflict formation, social media plays a very important role. And in 2018, Facebook actually took responsibility, and the authorities acknowledged the company's role in the conflict and removed 425 almost Facebook pages and 17 Facebook groups. So all I want to say and in this discussion is that, as I said earlier in my speech, in the last session, that freedom of speech comes with a responsibility, and when we are using social media, a wide variety of scopes open up for us. So we should be careful what we believe in and what we share in our profiles, because it has various impacts on other people's life. So yeah, that's all I wanted to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Othi. I hope I have now a better kind of the volume. With that in mind, we have limited time, somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes of question and answers. I was advised that, of course, we start in this room. If you have one or two very urgent questions, and if not, of course, it would be great to give the floor to the wider audience. But if you have one or two very short, they should be really very short, pointed questions in the room. The floor is yours. Of course, as you do, introduce yourself and ask a question. And I'll be fast. Yes, George?
If I may I go ahead? Yes. I just want to thank you again for having this conversation. And I was in the last two sessions, and it's quite informing and important to have this type of a discussion. But one thing that I want to make a comment on is when on September 26th, when the commune of Minembwe was announced, and I was quite shocked by the avalanche of hate speeches that came out of the social media and everywhere, and from the authority down to the mainstream. And it made me thinking that Congolese people are kind of misinformed about the real issues they're facing. And if you look at the way they responded to the commune of Minembwe, you would think that's the only one issue they have to face, and the rest don't matter. And that made me thinking that maybe we should start another process of educating the Congolese people as to the real issues they have to face, or they have been facing. One is the corruption of the leaders, their own leaders. And I mean, we can go on throughout the history of Congo from Mobutu up to now. And when you hear their leaders speaking, you think that they've been serving all their population, and the only issue that is left at their table to solve is the problem of foreigner people who've invaded them. And that's quite a deviation from the real issues. The real issues for the Congolese people are the numbers of people who are out there without job. The unemployment rate is unbelievable. The regular citizens live by $2, less than $2 a day. And you know, the millions of billions of dollars have been looted by the leaders. We have the case of Kamere, Vital Kamere, who've alleged of stealing like $52 million. So can we, if I go straight to the point, can we start a conversation as to the real issues of Congolese people, so that they will realize that the Banyamulenge are not the real issues? Maybe they have other issues they have to tackle. And thank you.
But thank you very much, George. Very two key pointed points that I fully share with you around one, the definition of the issues in Congo as a matter of really leadership in solving real issues, pressing issues that Congolese face, and very importantly, in narratives around the process of the crisis, the tendency to externalize let's say the responsibilities around the crisis. Very key points. One more question I will allow in this space before we move, I guess, outside, hopefully on Rohingya and of course, to keep up the good balance. Or both. I don't see any. So in that in mind, Dr. Caisse. Of course, I don't have access to the questions, so we agreed that you will be feeding them. Thank you. So minorities.
So here we have a question. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
So no, this is the first question that we picked up from the group. So anybody can jump in.
I'd like to disagree, Zeba Parvin, because I think you can see that from the example of indigenous people that actually it's the other way around. That once you have international collaboration between minority groups, every single group feels stronger for not being isolated and for not being forgotten. And by having these international networks of minorities, I mean, there is something called the Minority Rights Group in London. It exists for a reason, because there are minorities in every continent, including Europe, who are not protected at all, because they're stigmatized or externalized, as we've discussed. So no, I think it's not Animal Farm. It's more like getting out of your bubble and getting less isolated by making networks of minorities. And I think that it's not about domination.
Very good. As you load another question, it's very key important. I think literature in minorities see that, like, wherever you have conflicts, of course, always people go for interests of their own, but sometimes also cooperation is possible. And I think not only the minority group, which is an NGO, but you have a forum for minorities already at the United Nations, and it was preceded by a working group on the minorities, which has been in existence since the 80s at the UN level. So, and that has always been a discursive space for minorities to bring up to the fore their issues. I had some of my learned scholars at the UN level as my PhD kind of committees and teachers. As Bjorn Eide was probably one of the early kind of rapporteurs on minorities who even proposed one of the key definitions that is used within the UN minorities. And the experience is that there is more cooperation, there is more space created than minorities in the space of domination, which are processes that you tend to get rather at the national level than anything else. Okay, another question? Yes, Kausar.
So we have the second question here. What are the roles of people like Dr. Mukwege and Aung San Suu Kyi in terms of?
Great question.
Anybody can
keep the question there, so the presenters, the floor is yours.
Great question.
And probably I will leave off some just a facilitator. But I think,
Felix,
yes.
Cannot hear you. We cannot hear you. Felix.
Okay. With that in mind, someone else go ahead, please.
Yep.
I hear no one going ahead. I guess.
Yeah.
I guess. Let me say this. I think sometimes in conflict there are individualities, but also there are collectives. And what I've found quite fascinating is sometimes there is a tendency to overemphasize the role of individuals. Some matter more than others. But that being said, those figures can be both forces for good. I mean, Dr. Mukwege in Congo has been primed for his role in women, violated women, rightly so, at Pansy. And I think he has done an amazing job in that space. And I think he was rightly awarded recognition internationally, many recognition internationally for that. I'm not quite sure whether his role in denouncing violence, in being inclusive enough in his narrative, has always been very clear enough. I don't think that I have seen him that very forcefully present in the scale as the moral, let's say, kind of compass of inclusivity in a very polarized Eastern Congolese landscape. I would personally, knowing the context, want to see a little bit more of him. Someone else?
Well, let me just make a comment, because I know I was a little bit involved into just following what Mukwege said after the attack of Gipupu, and if Mukwege was somebody who was from Kasai or from other far region, away from southern Kivu or away from the Banyamulenge, I would quite understand. But one thing that I get confused with, and I was a little bit troubled, was the fact that he was not, he was partial into the issues of the Banyamulenge. And he did not quite denounce all the attacks and devastation of the Banyamulenge equally as he did for the case of Gipupu. And that's where you realize the indifference of leaders and some people who are elite in the country, where they start taking positions in the issue where they should be fair and impartial. So my comment to that is just like at the individual level, they have a choice to make. But when they already raised it to the international level, I mean, they have to play the role as of the Nobel Prize winners. So they have to be at the high level and not take some part into the issues of on the ground. So that's one thing that I have to say. And that's not himself. There are other people who you will think sometimes they'll be quiet. There's something that we've been always talked about, the indifference of different people on the issues. And sometimes they'll just say something when one thing happened and they leave the other one aside. So it's just very confusing and it's troubling, and then people should read carefully and understand the whole issue and say as they are. That's my comment I can make.
Thanks, George. Thanks, George.
Can I make one quick comment?
No,
yeah,
can we
very quick comment on the question?
Something.
Yeah, very
one, and then
very quick one.
About
yes. Yes, thank you very much. For me, I wrote a small article on a Erodia case, which came during the period which is known as mapping report. So how Mukwege is presenting that, yes, crimes has been committed, but is presenting like someone having ambition to do, maybe to aspire to something in the future. Of course, as he got Nobel Prize, yes, he did a great job in the past. But what we are talking, discrimination on some group of people, is in the process of that mapping report. So he's trying to sell that report, but the fact that what happens is not like describing what happened, really like claiming for justice. There is this part, of course, in the mapping report, there is something about, there is a small paragraph about the crime which were committed by the Banyamulenge, but how it is committed was in that insecurity also context. Of course, justice has to be done for crimes which has been committed, but this campaign came along with this conflict of the South Kivu. So how, as George said, yeah, they jump, balkanization, justice and everything. So there is, and everywhere, like we see Fayulu jumping on that, is a politician. Mukwege is aspiring maybe in the future to something. So this has to be contextualized again in a context how he's trying to advocate for justice, but why today, specific context, and linking different things and the conflict which has been in Congo today, Banyamulenge, the same people like we saw in Gipupu. So he's trying to mix things. I hope, even the attention he has got, for me, I said last time here in Brussels, I was surprised. He's more protected than thousands of people are being killed like Minembwe. MONUSCO just they're running behind one person. As long as refugees camp are being attacked, the houses are being destroyed. So there is this amalgam. So thank you very much.
So we'll have the next question, please, coming up, and I think it's for Mr. Aviat, and the question is, as you see on the screen. So if you kindly very brief about responding, because we are actually overshooting the time. Javier.
I would say the name Rohingya didn't appear. It has always been there. It is just being officially recognized or not recognized, allowed to say it out loud or not allowed to say it out loud. And pretty much like any ethnic race that is being enforced by a government arbitrarily, or any governments or a state where the government control how the population is portrayed. It's been the case for the Rohingya, where Burmese military regimes and subsequent regimes at times allowed, at times not allowed. So I would say it didn't appear, it has always been there. It is a question of when it is allowed to appear on the history pages and when it is suppressed to disappear or try to erase from the history pages. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think we'll take the just two last questions. Again, just to be cautious about time. And here is one I found very interesting. And the question is about DRC and why there is no political will. So those who are expert, you are requested to jump in to answer the question, please.
Please, can I give Felix the floor? I will respond after.
But I tend to have a very problematic microphone, so that's a problem. That's why he's. Can you hear me now?
It's again breaking up. So, Pierre, do you want to answer?
Okay, let me answer it very quickly. How my understanding. I think they are part. Some of them are part on in this kind of hatred speeches against Banyamulenge. Like I heard last time about this suspension of the Minembwe commune. The advisor of the president of the republic, what he said was terrible about that. Fayulu is a big politician, so they are stakeholders. So there is no political will unless we get a miracle to address that. So, but the problem is most of them they have the same thinking. When you see religious, I say that before, when we saw some politician also they proliferate such kind of hate speech. But of course, Congo has the law to suppress this kind of speeches. They have law to prosecute those people. So, which means that maybe some cases can be initiated to try. So a victim can initiate it and try how justice system in Congo can react. So I think people have never tried in Congo except the part we said about Erodia. But until now, I think we need some cases to try and to see how the justice system will react. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jean-Pierre. I will take the last question from the audience now. And this is very interesting because the audience wanted to know, how do you really unlock the potentials of people from harmful violence and seek justice? It's a very broad question, but I think very pertinent. Any panelists are welcome to answer.
I'd like to say something about this because I think this is not about Banyamulenge. This is about all minorities. And I think it's very important to not make it specific to one particular group because that's how we fail to see patterns. And I think the problem precisely is that, we assume that in Congo, issues are tribal. We still haven't left the colonial era. We haven't decolonized our minds at all about the causes of conflict in the Congo. It's clear that in every single country in the world, the cause of minority problems are political and sometimes maybe even economic or strategic or envy or whatever it may be. But they're never ethnic or identity-based. Those things don't cause genocide. They are the excuse for it. And I think whether it's the Banyamulenge or whether it's the Rohingya, by maybe tackling the myths, as Felix said, by looking at the myths that are perpetuated, we have a job to do as journalists, as scholars, as people working just on social media for fun. Even if you're writing on social media, just tackle those myths, expose them as myths. And maybe that way we can show that this is a very wide problem. This didn't start yesterday. This started, I believe, with modernity and with this tendency of the state that Thea mentioned in her seminar, the tendency of the state. I think it was Greg Stanton actually who said it, that the state actually wants to normalize all its citizens, and it uses nationality to do that, and thereby excludes some people, not just on ethnic grounds, but on any grounds. The Rohingya are not excluded on ethnic grounds, they're excluded on religious grounds. So it could be religion, it could be class, it could be that you're Chinese in Indonesia, it could be that you're this or that. It could be that you're an indigenous person. These people have nothing in common, but they all have in common that they're subject to processes of exclusion. So in fact, I agree. Somebody said you need to look at the state. The state is a key actor in every single situation. And it isn't just social media and hate media. That cannot work without organization. So maybe we should go back to Greg Stanton, Genocide Watch, look a little bit more at the stages of genocide and the elements of genocide, and recognize it when we see it.
Thank you, Dr. Helen. Although I promised the last question, but in the meantime, I received another very interesting, I would say, an observation. And since there is a reference to mapping report, I wanted to share it with the audience so that if people are interested as a researcher, they can take a cue. And if any of the panelists have a quick response, very briefly, you're welcome to do, because we are not very, possibly we are not aware of the quoted mark here, the best leader and the mapping report. Delphine, do you want to comment on that?
I think there is just a small paragraph on the crime committed against the Banyamulenge. It's a small paragraph is there in the mapping report, and there are names which you read and you recognize this is Banyamulenge were killed. But what I said is, what I mentioned here is the context now they are presenting it. So it's the context, and they mix the mapping report with the origin of the Banyamulenge, the conflict in the South Kivu, or what. This is what's like, but there is some small paragraph in that, I think, about the Banyamulenge, if I'm not wrong. Is there small paragraph just?
There is quite more.
It's not just one small paragraph. There's plenty.
Yeah.
And for example, I had an argument with a woman in Brussels who said that all Banyamulenge were liars. So as proof, she sent me the mapping report. So then I went into the mapping report and I found her plenty of evidence, paragraph after paragraph, that the Banyamulenge were also victims. And so, you can use it. It's like the Bible. It's like saying the Bible says this and the Bible says that. The Bible says everything. So does the mapping report. But I thought maybe Delphine, you would want to say something on this.
Delphine, go ahead.
I agree with the Dr. Helen on the aspect. The mapping report has a lot to say about Banyamulenge, but on an additional aspect I would simply add is at the same time it adds the Banyamulenge, or it describes the Banyamulenge as the perpetrators. In many cases, you see mapping reports trying to describe Banyamulenge in the same way as armed groups or a rebellion. It confuses whether the AFDEL, the Laurent Kabila rebellion, or the next one, which is a RCD, in the same way as a single ethnic group called Banyamulenge. That's a very big issue. So I'm not a lawyer, but I think that's something of what we need to look at and see if there is any way to differentiate or to dissociate through the mapping report Banyamulenge as a community, but also in some instances where Banyamulenge have individually participated within any rebellion or any armed group. And maybe to add one more point, if you allow, Ahmed. I think on a Congo level, hate speech is politicians do use hate speech as a scapegoat when they failed to deliver. That's my impression. Many of the politicians have taken Banyamulenge issue or Tutsi issue in general as a scapegoat when they have to mobilize. I think at this point, I seem to somehow disagree with George's point of view. On the side of Banyamulenge, it's a very huge issue. Of course, we need maybe to indicate on our Congolese society what is their main problem, but also we need to tackle this as a big issue on the side of Banyamulenge. Whenever a politician keeps repeating, we only have a single problem, is Banyamulenge, the entire society feels that's the only issue. And that's why one of the origin of the hate speeches. I'm sure I've come across many people who simply believe and surely believe this is the only problem. You can meet many people across the street. You ask him or her, do we have any problem in DRC or Congo? She or he will simply tell you it's only one. That's Banyamulenge. And from my point of view, I think we need to consider this as a very huge and a big issue and an urgent one to be tackled, whether within the academics or within the media, but also within the politics. That's the point I was trying to add. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank you.
Can I just say that, just to allude to what, to echo what Delphin just said, and if you look at the level of literacy illiteracy in the Congo is just high. And I heard one time somebody saying that politicians are very happy when they leading a huge population which is not educated on issues and who has no understanding of the real issues. Like I've heard some of the leaders who are campaigning on only one platform. If I'm elected to be a deputy or anybody, I will remove the issue of Rwanda in the Congo. I think you've heard of those speeches, hate speeches. So, and they get it. It's just because they fail completely to understand that the infrastructure is an issue, the corruption is an issue. Only leaders have access to the resources, and they are sending their kids to abroad for study, and the rest of the kids are there exposed to be used in the army. All those are just unbelievable of issues that Congo has, and yet they are looking in one side of the one small tiny thing they are making as an issue. So it's a very disappointing, and we have to be able to raise those issues. And I think that's what we should invest more time in, just exposing all the issues, and then they can pick which one is more relevant to them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we would end the Q&A session here. And dear audience, all the questions are in the chat room, in the YouTube and Facebook pages. And you are very much welcome to pursue your questions. And from the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, we shall be able to pass it down to the respective panelists, those who address these questions, and we can do this back and forth. Now at this stage, I would be requesting Dr. Felix to kindly wrap up this session, and at the end, I will just add some concluding remarks. Dr. Felix, the floor is yours again. Thank you.
Can I just say one word before we finish, please? Because I'm not showing, but I want to say one word. In the PowerPoint, which we can make available to anyone who wants it, they can just write to me, hinchins@iss.nl. The hopeful note that I wanted to strike at the end with the videos is a song from South Africa called Jerusalema. And what has happened is that all over the world, literally thousands and millions of people are now doing socially distanced dancing around Jerusalema. And it's massive. And it's actually quite beautiful because it's people taking a song, you don't even understand the words, it's in Shosha or in Debele, and it's a song that has inspired so many people. It's just amazing. So please have a look at some of the videos. I'm happy to share them with you. I wanted to show one because they're so amazing. Thank you. And I think I'd like to see the Rohingya doing that and the Banyamulenge.
And the audience, the link is
Thank you.
flashed on the screen. And if you follow, we'll also put it up in our YouTube channel. Dr. Felix.
Thank you very much, Kauser, and thank you, Helen, for the positive ending note of Jerusalem. Just for the sake of public shaming, anyone who hasn't heard of Jerusalem yet, that's a crime against. I should stop there since we are talking about very serious stuff. Thank you very much for your engagement, for you all. I'm very much sorry for the microphone troubles. Even I was butting in to kind of making some comments about the mapping and issues around that, but I refrained from doing that. But also key important, unless I guess if I start from that, but also from hyping individuals, hyping specific documents. Every time I think we need to look at ways we can look at issues like this in their globality rather than specific moments and so on. And that's very important for me when also talking about documents like mapping reports, but also documents I shared. I think one link to studies by Queen's Mary kind of reports on the Rohingyas that I found fascinating reading, at least informative for me who doesn't know much about the situation. But anytime we hype those kind of specific documents, particularly I find quite very interesting the current mapping of the hyping of the mapping report, a document issued 10 years ago in a country which has known more than 10 years of conflict since it was authored. So any justice path that can take place today in the Congo based on mapping report would be missing out the most recent dynamics over the last 10 years of people killed with memories which are even fresher than whatever is in the mapping report. And every other community is left, lost people in mapping report. But justice in Congo today would not really be just if it's only premised on the mapping report, which is 10 years old, in a country which has known conflicts over the last, since then continuously. And that's the poverty of the hyping of mapping reports under big kind of personality games and under big agendas which are far beyond the justice realm. And I say that as someone, as a student or a scholar in the field of justice. That being said, very much engagement again in trying the difficult dynamics of that you started already weeks back of linking what is happening in Myanmar with relation to the Rohingya community, which has of course crossed the boundaries because of the crisis back home. In linking that to the situation of the Banyamulenge today in Eastern Congo, in trying to stay positive, again, in the sense of dealing with landscape where polarization leads to a retreat of rationality and more emotionalism that blinds the actors involved. And I thank this space, of course, for creating these exchanges. I thank those who have been very much actively engaged in social media, and I thank presenters who took their time to present. I thank, of course, in Winnipeg for hosting this generously and caring. That's the key word, I guess. Caring. That's very important. And with that in mind, I look forward to the next exchanges and hope this will continue until, of course, many of the issues that have been raised are addressed, including educating population, educating leadership, or at least fighting and striving for positive leadership, which really tackles issues or at least faces issues in order to address them rather than, let's say, scapegoat and blame. With that in mind, I will say the floor is back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Felix. Thank you, Dr. Felix. Thank you, Delphine, Jean-Pierre, Dr. Helen Hingen, George joining all the way from States, and Orti from Bangladesh to be with us this morning session, and in Winnipeg morning, I say. So in conclusion, I would like to just add a couple of quick points. First is, as Dr. Helen started the presentation in the first session, that one of the important aspects of understanding or comparing two cases actually comes from the idea that all the minorities, in many ways, and are at stake in this present global system. We are just talking about two cases here, Rohingyas and Banyamulenge, but there are many. And as you see the question and answer feed in the YouTube channel and in other YouTube and the Facebook pages, you'll find people have written about Armenian groups, Uyghur groups, and all these things. And this brings to the question of states' responsibility in the current global system, and how and why these states must be held responsible in treating their minorities than that of their majority. Second point, I take cue from Javier's comment about education. And since Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is deeply involved in advancing education in the camps, so I would like to say that, and it came from the comment of, I think, George made that 67% of Banyamulenge are uneducated. So education plays a huge role in terms of shaping the future of these stateless people. So those who have tuned in today, please have a sympathetic ear towards this cause, because we are all talking about a generation which might be totally lost if they are not educated properly in terms of shaping and taking control of their future themselves. And my last observation is very interesting to compare this, not compare, I would say evaluate both these cases of Banyamulenge Rohingya, because in Myanmar, and especially in Rakhine, we see little over 21 groups of ethnic armed organizations are directly engaged in conflict with the state and Tatmadaw in Myanmar. And the interesting part is these 21 groups of ethnic minorities and their militias, they actually do not fight with each other. And there is no case, to my knowledge, as of today, that these groups ever got into problem with, or armed conflict with others. Actually, they support each other in terms of training and all. For example, Arakan Army, which you come across quite often, particularly in 2020 and end of 2019, they actually were housed by another ethnic armed group in the northeast part of Rakhine. So this is quite interesting if we see the intergroup conflict, and as I see the questions, sent to our feed, and Rohingya cases. So I mean, just a way of thinking, and I'm just sharing this observation with you. So having said so, once again, from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada and ISS Erasmus Rotterdam, we thank all of the audience who patiently waited and joined the discussions. And we'll share the feeds of Dr. Helen YouTube feed and others. So please go have a look, and you will have tons of information and maybe more insights about these two cases. And without further adding up and spoiling your time, let me say goodbye and stay fine, stay well wherever you are. Thank you, all the panelists and speakers, once again from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute. Goodbye.
And see you on the 17th.